And a historic night for Kamala Harris as she became the first Black woman and person of South Asian descent to accept a major party's presidential nomination, and she would become the first female president if elected. During her speech, she called on all to reject political division and get behind her to chart a new way forward, not as members of one party or another, but as Americans. The former prosecutor saying, "My entire career, I've only had one client, the people," calling out former President Trump by saying the only client he has ever had himself. New Jersey taking center stage once again, but a more somber moment. The brother of fallen U.S. Capitol Police Officer Brian Sicknick, Craig, stood before the delegates with his mother Gladys, an emotional tribute to his fallen brother, reminding them of that President Trump-led insurrection on January 6th that took the life of his brother, calling him a hero who died defending our country. Harris also touching on those lost on January 6th and invoking her prosecutor's background when she referred to Trump's explicit intent to free those who assaulted law enforcement officers at the Capitol, saying, "Consider what he intends to do if we give him power again." Harris pulled no punches, also taking on the Middle East conflict head-on, pledging to always stand up for Israel's right to defend itself, but acknowledging the plight of the Palestinian people, saying, "What has happened in Gaza in the past 10 months is devastating. So many innocent lives lost," Harris said, desperate, hungry people fleeing to safety over and over again. The scale of suffering is heartbreaking. Polls out prior to the convention show Harris tied or with a slight lead over former President Trump. But a new FDU poll out today focusing on gender and race shows Vice President Harris's lead grows substantially. Dan Cassino, professor of government and politics and executive director for the poll, joins me now. Dan, thanks for joining me.
Oh, always a pleasure.
Dan, so we are just coming off the DNC. Vice President Kamala Harris feeling a lot of momentum. We know this could be a tight race, but your poll found that the vice president has an edge over Donald Trump in some areas. Tell me what the poll found specifically.
Right. So our overall number shows that Vice President Harris is up by 7 points over former President Trump. But the really interesting part of this is what's driving those figures. So we have two different sets of results. In the first, we actually took a look at masculinity. And there's been a lot of talk about masculinity in this race with Donald Trump, who projects this very kind of traditional old model of masculinity, and with Vice Presidential nominee on the Democratic side, Tim Walz, who is very much doing this different sort of softer masculinity. So we want to take a look at exactly how masculinity is playing into this race. And so we did, and we've run these questions a lot of times in the past, is we asked men and women to talk about their gender identities, talk about whether they consider themselves masculine or feminine, or how masculine or how feminine they are. And what we found is that Trump's support is almost entirely among the men who say that they are completely masculine. So on the masculine and femininity chart, they're as far on the masculine side as you can possibly get. So those men support Trump 64-30 over Harris, so a huge margin. All other men, so that's about half of men in the US who say they're completely masculine, that traditional masculinity, the other half of men support Harris by a 20-point margin, 55-35. Interestingly, those men, those other men, are no different than women in their views. All of them support Harris by between about 18 to 20 points.
And just to clarify, this poll was conducted before this week's Democratic convention.
It was actually conducted before and slightly during the Democratic convention. Now, that does mean that we expect there's going to be a little bit of an extra bump for Harris. During a convention, and immediate aftermath of the convention, partisans of the president or whoever just had the convention are more likely to pick up the phone. So you tend to get more of them. We actually didn't see too much of a problem with that. Republicans and Democrats both seemed very willing to answer our questions and pick up the phone. And generally, since former President Trump has been on the ballot, we haven't had too much of a trouble getting Republicans to pick up the phone. There really is no such thing as a shy Trump voter who don't want to pick up the phone and talk to us.
Right. Dan, prior to this election, and actually less than a month ago, the race was between two white men. Was any of this even part of the conversation?
Oh, I think it absolutely was. I think actually one of the big problems faced by President Biden is that he does not project masculinity. We think of masculinity, that's about being assertive. It's about being strong. And really, one of the big knocks against President Biden is that boy, he doesn't look strong. He looks weak. So we talk about masculinity contests. It's not just contests between men and women. It's contests between men and men. You might remember in the 2020 election when former President Trump and now President Biden seemed to have an argument about a push-up contest, or they talked about Biden was going to say he's going to take Trump behind the shed and whip him. I mean, we still have these masculinity contests, regardless whether it's men versus women or men versus men.
But now we have a woman of color. So will she have the advantage moving forward?
So what's really interesting is we really want to take a look at the difference between race and gender on this. And so we actually did a priming experiment on here in this survey where we asked people about what issues were important to them. And for about a third of the respondents, we included the race of the candidates in there. And when we include the race of the candidates in there, this goes from being a relatively close election to being a blowout for Harris, where she's up by 14 points when we ask about race before we ask about who you're going to vote for. And what that's telling us is that identity really does matter. We have all sorts of pundits and strategists say, don't talk about identity, don't talk about identity. But when we talk about identity, what that tends to do is actually brings black and brown voters back to the Democratic Party. Right now, about 20 to 30% of them are supporting Trump. When we actually talk about identity, talk about racial identity, that goes down to almost nothing.
Okay. Dan, 70 days. 70 days. What can each candidate do?
Right now, what former President Trump has to do is he has to solidify his base and he has to expand it. So he's doing very well among those MAGA voters. He has to start winning over moderates. And the challenge for him is, how do you keep the MAGA people on your side while getting the moderates? Vice President Harris, what she really has to do is prove herself. She still is relatively unknown. She has to get moderates and independents comfortable with her.
All right. We will have to see what happens. Dan, thank you so much for joining me.
My pleasure.